Hello everyone, my name's Karel, and today we're going to be taking a look at detection systems in From the Depths. This is one of those topics that's really complex, really in-depth, but when you really start dealing with it, it boils down to a limited set of fairly well-defined rules. So while it looks exceedingly complex at first glance, really as long as you stay within some guidelines, you're probably in good shape. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at all of our types of detection. Now these are all in the AI menu under detection, and actually before I do this I'm going to show you one other thing here. If I hit escape here and go into options, there is under here, let's see, I believe it's under miscellaneous? No, config? Yeah, config here. At least I believe it's config. Yeah, here we go. So right here, this automatic detection accuracy. This is important because it means that at a setting of 1, you will always have perfect detection, and the current value here is set to 0.1. So if I do NEATR settings in 2019 and hit that here, that will change the automatic detection accuracy, and we will get a much less accurate detection. If I look at the previous settings, again, I think these are introduced very recently here in a recent patch, since I'm on dev test, looking at physics changes for NEATR and that sort of thing. Anyway, the settings for automatic detection have always been at 0.1, so the NEATR settings of 2014 are perfectly accurate for this. So the 2014 settings, the automatic detection accuracy started out at 0.1. And that's consistent on any campaign that you play in NEATR. It's consistent in the designer, anything in there. Different campaigns can have different detection settings. So when you start up a new campaign or start up a new world or anything like that, it's worth going in there and checking out that config tab and just seeing what the automatic detection accuracy is set to. So more or less this is going to mean that my detections are going to be very inaccurate when I automatically detect things. And if you set this all the way down to 0, it means that a vehicle will have no sense of when there's another vehicle, an enemy vehicle rather, on the playing field at all, and you have to rely on detection components in order to detect it. If there's any automatic detection accuracy whatsoever, you will always auto-detect that vehicle. However, the position information that your vehicle or that your AIs are given based on that automatic detection is very poor at 0.1. And as I go more towards 1, that would get better and better. So that's how that works, and worth checking when you start a new campaign in an environment that you're not familiar with. Alright, so going back to our components here. Well, first off, let's go ahead and take a look in the Detection tab. Now, I'm not going to go through every component here individually. Rather, what I'm going to do is try and outline the various different types of components and the differences between them in order to highlight sort of what each thing is good for, and then pretty much we can go through this list and say, well, what is each of these actually used for? Basically, by identifying the component types, we can identify what exactly each of these components will be good at. So the first thing to look at is a trade-off between passive versus active detection. Active detection usually involves emitting some sort of signal, whether that's infrared light, whether that's radar, whether that's sonar waves. It involves emitting some sort of energy that gets reflected off the target and comes back to you that allows you to make that sort of detection. Now that's not always the case. In the case of the camera, an infrared camera, technically those are passive detection since they're visual based, but in From the Depths they are treated as active detection mechanisms. So for the purposes of our discussion, we will be treating these as active detection. So active emits signal and senses the return of that signal in order to detect a vehicle. Passive sensors will just detect the emissions from an enemy vehicle. So if I look at say a passive radar, that's going to detect any active output of radar from an enemy vehicle. So any of these radar components, the Radar 360, the Radar 90, and the Radar Gimbal Tracker, will generate detections on the parent vehicle if the parent vehicle has one of these, if the vehicle that you're talking about doing the tracking has a passive radar on it. So while yes, the Radar 360 will give you detection on things in a 360-degree arc using radar, the passive radar system, if mounted on an opposing vehicle, will be able to detect the active emissions of that radar dish and say, yes, I see you, there is definitely something out there emitting radar waves, and it's roughly off in that direction and at that range. So passive detection is basically a way of determining where enemies are without specifically having to emit a active signal in order to make that detection. So that's passive versus active. Another trade-off here that's common amongst all these is a detector versus a tracker. Now, pretty much everything up in this top area up here, these first 3 rows of things, are all detectors. And what that means is a detector is something that will provide initial detection. They tend to be less accurate about the detections that they provide, but they can track multiple targets at once. For instance, if I put a Radar 360 on this vehicle, and I've wired up all of these AI components here so that we can easily see what's going on, if I was to put a Radar 360 up here, the Radar 360 cannot see left, right, or backwards in this position. Let's pick a little bit of a spot here. Yeah, right here. So it cannot see downwards through itself, but it can see in every other direction. So it can see out to the right, it can see out to the left, it can see out front, it can see up, and it can see down. So it's got 5 of the cardinal directions covered, and more or less what this is going to do is emit an active radar signal in all of those directions, and anything that bounces that signal back is going to be picked up by this radar and detected. That's in all of those directions all at once. That's really good. So why would we want to use trackers? Well, these detectors do not provide very accurate detections. If I mouse over the Radar 360, there's a lot of information on these pop-ups, and it's all very good information, very worthwhile checking out the information on every single one of these in detail. I'm not going to do that for the purposes of this tutorial. You can read that yourself easily enough within the build menu. But what we are looking at here is specifically the angular error in the bearing to target. That's the first thing in that list that's has dash prefixes on it. So the angular error in the bearing to target is 2 degrees. 2 degrees doesn't sound like much out of a 360-degree arc, but when you're trying to aim a cannon at 1,000 meters out, 2 degrees means missing by 20 meters, potentially. So a 2-degree angular error in the bearing to target, kind of a big deal, especially if that angular error happens to be up or down, if you're talking about vehicles which are normally fairly short. So 20 meters is easily enough to make your cannon miss entirely. The range error on this one is better at 0.4%. That's actually reasonably good. So this is pretty reasonably good at determining range. But we also have this creates a detection 10 times a second. That's the third really important value here. That's average. 10 times a second isn't great, it's not bad, that's just kind of average. So that's what a detector does. A tracker down here, if I look at the radar gimbal tracker, that halves the range error and brings the angular error down to 1/4 of its original value and creates a detection 20 times per second. Now, creating detections more often means that you get a better average between all of those detections of what the target's actual position is, and it also means that a fast maneuvering target that changes its velocity very quickly is more likely to be accurately tracked because its change in velocity is getting picked up quicker. So a gimbal tracker here is a better sensor, but it can only track one target. So that is detectors versus trackers. Over here we've got buoys, and the buoys are a little odd. These do not emit an active emission, essentially, from the vehicle that they're carried on. So if I was to mount a Radar 360 on this vehicle can be detected by a passive radar detector. If I was to mount a missile radar buoy holder on this vehicle cannot be detected by radar. Well, or by passive radar. So, unless there's another active radar signal emitter. So a buoy holder does not enable passive detection on its parent vehicle. But it does, however, there's some downsides to this. You have to fire a missile with the buoy on it. And that missile is going to be the locus of detection, if that makes sense. It's going to be the point where the detections emanate from. And as you can see here, angular error on this is not particularly great. Range error on it is not particularly great. It's less accurate than the Radar 360 in both cases. It also requires more units of general processing power and creates detections less often. So it's also got a not huge detection range. So that's not great. There's a lot of downsides to this. But it does not create an active detection signal, so passive detectors cannot pick up on the vehicle that is using this. And that can be useful. It also can be attached to a missile. Missiles can track things. Therefore, you can fire a missile with one of these on it, and that missile will go fly out and get near something. And there's a lot of interplay there where you can launch missiles in various directions and create kind of a net or web of detection around you. So you can do some interesting things with these, but keep in mind they are providing very low quality detections for you. That applies also to sonar. So you've got radar and sonar buoy holders. Important thing to note on these, for every one of these you place on your vehicle, you can only have one missile in flight that's active with that buoy on it. So if I was to place one of these on, say, this block in here. Okay, so I've got one radar buoy. Now that means I can fire one radar guided missile, or one radar buoy missile. One missile with a radar buoy component on it can be in flight at any given time launched from this vehicle. If I was to try and fire another one, it's simply not going to launch. I cannot launch that missile unless I have a second radar buoy holder on there until the first missile gets despawned. Now, despawning could occur if the missile runs into something. It could occur if, say, the missile just despawns for having been out there too long. Number of circumstances that can occur in. It could get shot down by lambs or flak. Any of those things would count as the missile despawning, so that we would then have the buoy holder would get its buoy back, and we would now be able to launch a new missile that would contain that buoy. So buoy holders are limiting in a lot of ways, but for that initial detection, they're a way of avoiding those passive detectors getting a hold of you. Alright, so that's buoys. If we take a look at sonar, let's just go ahead and start working our way through the various different types here. So we've got sonar here. Let's go ahead and start with that. Sonar is underwater detection. Sonar is actually a sound emission, which sounds a little weird. Submarines use this almost exclusively in the modern military. More or less what you're doing is you're sending out a pulse of sound that travels through whatever medium that you're talking about, in this case water, and that sound reflects off of various surfaces, various different things, and comes back to you, and based on the reflections, the sound that the reflections make can be influenced by the material that it bounces off of, and all sorts of things like that. More or less based on those reflections, we get an accurate picture of what's around us in the medium that we're talking about, in this case the water. Now, in real life, there are all sorts of complications to this. There's all sorts of crazy things that can happen with it. The sonar sensors have to be crazy sensitive, so you're listening really, really hard underwater, and that can be confused by, explosions going off in the water somewhere else, and making it very hard to detect things. There's the fact that you are making a lot of noise when you use one of these things, so a passive detector can obviously detect you. Just all sorts of weird things. There's even the concept of basically temperature differentials in water. If there's a temperature differential at 2 points in the water, say there's a sudden shift in the temperature of the water from a flat or across a flat plane, then the sonar won't be able to penetrate that very effectively. So there's all sorts of weird little interactions there that real sonar has to deal with. From the depth, sonar is not nearly that complex. Basically, if you're in the water, this thing is going to provide some sort of detection on you. The only ways to avoid this are to use very flat armor, and also to basically light alloy and things along those lines. There's some armoring stuff that we'll get into shortly. So you try and avoid components that are going to return a signal on the outside of your vehicle, and you try and stay out of the water as much as possible, and that will prevent your sonar from detecting you. Passive sonar here, it's worth noting, there are missiles that can use sonar detection. Passive sonar will detect those missiles, and that is one of the only ways to do so. We'll get into that more in the missile tutorial that's upcoming, but for now, just understand passive sonar, super useful. If you are dragging a tow in the water, you want passive sonar. Okay, so that's what sonar is. Sonar is largely based on, like I said, the machining of the materials that are in the water. It's also based on the amount of material that you have under the water. So a large amount of material under the water is going to reflect much more on sonar. A small amount of material, or material at a very long distance, not going to be so great for sonar. So the next one up is radar. Radar is basically a form of sonar. That is, it operates very similarly to sonar, just with a different type of energy being emitted. So a radar is going to emit waves that travel easily through the air, i.e. not solid surfaces, and are reflected very well from solid surfaces. So usually, in order to avoid detecting the surface components, or rather the surface of the terrain around you, or the water, or whatever, a radar will have a minimum altitude gate. That's not really modeled in From the Depths, so radar in From the Depths detects pretty much everything above the water. That being said, radar will get very minimal return off smooth parts or well-machined parts. It's just going to be a lot harder to detect something that doesn't really reflect much. It's relying on the bounce back of that signal that we're emitting. So you can basically lower the amount of detection that's going to occur from radar on your vehicle by making your vehicle small, low to the ground or the surface, and trying to make it out of as smooth of parts as possible. Next up, let's take a look at the camera series. Cameras are basically all going to find things that are large. That's really their goal in life. It can detect anything based on its size, and that's really the only way to hide yourself from camera is size. Now, you can get a little bit of help there from smoke, if I've understood this correctly. Like if there is a smoke cloud between you and the target, cameras won't necessarily function through that very well. However, that's very difficult to achieve with any degree of regularity. So most of the time cameras are going to find you. The real limit to them is that they are very, very bad at determining range. Now that can work in your favor, because if you're trying to create a stealthy vehicle, having a camera alone is not going to provide an accurate range estimate. And so they're going to need to have some other sort of detection out there in order to get a good firing solution on you. That being said, cameras are going to know you're there. Really not a whole lot of way around that. Alright, so next up we have the infrared camera. Infrared cameras detect hot targets. Yep, that's their purpose in life. They look at things and see if they're hot. Jokes aside, that is basically useful to determine if a target is emitting a large amount of heat. It will create very good quality detections based on angular error. Again, similar to the regular camera, you're not going to get very good range detection with these. However, you will get excellent detections on things that are hot or producing a lot of heat. Now, various different things will produce heat. RTGs produce a small amount of heat. Engines produce a lot of heat, but it can be funneled out of your vehicle in a specific direction using exhausts. Something I haven't really talked about with engine exhausting. you want to exhaust towards the side of a vehicle that is not facing towards the enemy. Because if you face your exhaust towards the enemy, they can find you with things like IR cameras. So you really want to make sure that your exhausts are pointed out like the back of your vehicle or something that's not going to be facing towards the enemy. That will especially come into play when we start talking about missile weapons. So the IR detection, you want to make sure that your vehicle is not emitting a lot of heat in order to avoid detection by this. So that is pretty much all of this column. We talked about the cameras. Let's go ahead and take a look at the coincidence rangefinders. This is a submenu in here, but really all of these do exactly the same thing in varying degrees of quality. These are rangefinders. They create fairly decent detection in the angular direction, or rather in angular bearing. So you get a pretty good idea of what the angle of the target is, and a reasonably accurate estimate of the range error. Now, what you see here, that the limiting factor is that third line of the bullet points down there. This creates a detection 4 times per second. That's not really enough to react quickly to fast-moving targets. If you're aiming at a naval target, a rangefinder is going to do a great job. If you're trying to aim a cram cannon that's not going to really respond well to trying to hit a fast-moving vehicle anyway, you're probably all right with a rangefinder. If you're trying to aim a laser, don't even try. Don't just save yourself the headache. So another problem with these is that they are very large. They come in 3 different sizes: the 5 meter, 7 meter, and 9 meter. The 9 meter is huge. This thing is enormous. Most detection components are 1 block in size. This one is 9 blocks in size. So it's really bulky, can be kind of hard to place if you're making a more compact vehicle. All that being said, what these are good for is armor. These things, especially the armored variants, are actually really durable. That makes them very difficult to strip off of your vehicle, and that can be pretty useful if you're talking about mounting these on, say, a turret, where you're likely to encounter a fair amount of fire incoming. So that's coincidence rangefinders. Next up is the wireless snooper. And this, as you can see here, provides very poor quality detections very infrequently. So not really good for a whole lot. But this thing can be placed on the inside of a vehicle. It does not require any sort of line of sight. If I place this down here, you'll notice that it can't see downwards directly. But that doesn't matter. It's telling me that it doesn't care. So I can place this entirely inside the vehicle, entirely enclosed. It will be just fine, and it will go on its merry way generating detections. So what exactly does this detect? Well, it detects any wireless emissions from AI components. So that means the wireless transmitter and receiver and the inter-vehicle transmitter, which we haven't talked about yet, are going to both be detected by this thing. And the longer of a distance the wireless transmitter has to transmit over, the more detection, or rather the better detection, that wireless snooper is going to provide. So that is a passive detection method, and it's one that, it's fairly typical of the traits of all of the passive detectors. All of these passive detectors aren't very accurate, but what they do is they let you see without being seen, and that's really quite useful. Alright, so the next one up is the retroreflection sensor. And we're just going to go through these passive sensors real quick. Retroreflection sensor will detect anything camera-based, with the exception of the IR cameras. It will not detect anything IR camera-based. So the retroreflection sensor will detect anything at a specific range. It's very good at detecting range, actually, though it doesn't detect very often. Angle is a little on the shaky side. It's maybe average. So it's also very cheap to run. It requires 0.1 units of general processing power. So we haven't really talked about that yet. We'll get into that in a moment. But basically the retroreflection sensors are very cheap, very easy to operate, and really there's absolutely no downside to these. These are a passive sensor. They cannot be detected by other passive sensors. So use this everywhere. There's really no reason not to. So another one up here is the passive sonar. As with all sonar detection, and I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, all sonar detection components must be underwater to operate. That includes the missile that you launch for the sonar missile buoy holder. The missile sonar buoy holder, if I get my words in the right order. So anything that's trying to do sonar detections needs to be underwater. The passive sonar 360 will basically detect anything that's emitting sonar signal. Similarly, the passive radar 360 will detect anything that's emitting an active radar signal. Again, the exceptions to that are the buoys. Passive sonar will not detect a missile sonar buoy holder, though they will detect the missile itself if you have a buoy on it. That's important to note. That means that that missile can get shot down more easily by countermeasures. And the same with the radar 360. It's going to detect the missile, or it's going to detect the vehicle that's mounting the radar component. One thing I haven't talked about over here is this telescope gimbal tracker. This is basically an alternate skin for the camera gimbal tracker. The stats are basically identical between the two. The only difference is this one's more expensive and might look better for some types of builds. Another specific sensor I want to look at is the laser rangefinder tracker, and this only detects already detected targets. So not really all that useful at first glance, but what this does do is it will very accurately pinpoint the range to the target, like super accurately. You will always get excellent accuracy or range accuracy with one of these things on your vehicle. Alright, so that is pretty much all of the components. One thing I haven't mentioned is that the regular gimbal trackers, all of these trackers require some sort of detection already or operate best with it. A lot of these will provide some amount of tracking, so if something gets within like 10 degrees of them, then they will lock on and track to it automatically. But something like the laser rangefinder tracker, this is the only detection component that absolutely requires that you have other detection on your vehicle. Alright, so that's pretty much all of our detection types. Moving on, let's go ahead and take a look at processing power. So processing power comes from in this card area of the AI menu, these general purpose processing cards. These don't require card slots in order to be placed. You can put them directly on any connector that is connected to an AI block, and it will add general purpose processing power to that AI. So there's really not a whole lot of downside to these. There's not really, they're not very durable, and they each add one processing power unit. Each of the detectors has a certain amount of processing power that it takes up in order to operate that at full capacity. The general purpose processing card gives you that processing power. Now the downside to these is their cost. These are 100 materials each, and that's not real cheap for something that you're going to need a lot of in most cases. So you don't want to just spam detection components all over your vehicle. You want to make sure that your detection types match the types of targets that your vehicle is likely going to come up against and have to try and shoot down. So in the case of, say, a laser vehicle, I would come in here and say, okay, a laser vehicle, what am I going to try and shoot with a laser vehicle? It's likely going to be something in the air. That means radar is going to be very effective. And it's likely going to be something hot because a lot of the ways of moving really fast in the air involve jets. So there's likely going to be an infrared signal. So I would say I want radar 360 on here or IR camera 360, and I definitely want a gimbal tracker of one or the other of these types, and I want a laser rangefinder tracker and a retro reflection sensor. So if I look at these, let's say I have a radar 360 that requires 1.5 units of general processing power. And let's say I have an IR camera gimbal tracker that requires 0.5 units. So I'm up to 2 units required. And let's say I add a radar gimbal tracker for another 1 unit, and a laser rangefinder tracker for 0.1 units, and a retro reflection sensor for another 0.1 unit. So I've got 3.2 units of general processing power required. That's not very much, and I can get away with that by, well, the mainframe itself actually has some processing power built in. So if I take a look at this, it is providing 2 units of general purpose processing power, and I need 3.2. Therefore, I can get away with adding exactly 2 of these general purpose processing cards, and I will be able to mount a Radar 360. I will be able to mount a radar tracker. If I come back in here, radar gimbal tracker. Let's just go ahead and slot that in here. And I will be able to mount a laser rangefinder tracker, let's say there, and a retro reflection sensor. And let's go ahead and put that, say, down here. I'll go over why I'm placing these where I am in a bit. And so that is all of our detection, and there are no complaints about the amount of processing power. If we come over here and look at our AI, I missed one of these, didn't I? Yeah, I said I was going to have a camera gimbal tracker on there. Yeah, okay. Let's go ahead and put the camera gimbal tracker in, let's say, right down here. So that is a full detection set, and that is 4.2. Actually, I must have miscalculated, or I just didn't set things up the way I said I was going to initially. Either way, that is 4.2, and so I need to add another general purpose processing power card. You can see here I have access to 4 units, and I need 4.2. So yeah, I'll just stick one more of these cards on here. Again, these are 100 materials apiece, so I want to be stingy with those where I can. And I now have perfect detection accuracy, or at least as best as my detection pieces can make out. Alright, so we've looked at the processing power. Let's go ahead and take a look at one more component here, and that is the inter-vehicle transmitter. This looks exactly like a wireless receiver. Like, exactly like a wireless receiver. If I put these down next to each other, yeah, they look identical. What this does, however, is it transmits and receives all detections between this specific set of AI components that are all linked together on this vehicle, and receive all detections from every other allied vehicle with one of these on it. So this is tied over to my mainframe. This mainframe is getting detection from all of the detection components that I've placed on this vehicle, and now it's transmitting and receiving detection through this intra-vehicle transmitter as well. And so every other vehicle will be able to take advantage of this vehicle's detection, and this vehicle will be able to take advantage of every other vehicle's detection. That can be super powerful when you start talking about swarms of vehicles, especially as they spread out and get detections from multiple angles and multiple ranges. A lot of these detection components provide lesser quality detections at long range, so you need to be a little careful about trying to use some of these at a very long range. That's actually like the 5th bullet point in here. Instrument has a relative detection range of 0.5 in comparison to other similar sensors, compared to something like, say, the gimbal tracker that has a relative detection range of 2. So these have a fairly well-defined range gate. The gimbal tracker will track targets better at a longer range than the Radar 360. Alright, so that is the inter-vehicle transmitter. Next up, let's go over configuring your detection. So we've put detection down all over this vehicle, and there's a reason behind the way I've placed things. First off, detection can be obscured by placing other components nearby. So if I put 2 radars here, this radar is not going to be able to see to the left because there's a block here. Likewise, this radar on the left is not going to be able to see to the right because there's a block here. One block is all it takes to entirely obscure vision out of the entire arc. These are not smooth arcs, they operate on cardinal directions. So if I have a radar that is set back, or let's just mount it, say, right here. This looked like a good spot at first glance. But I cannot see right, I cannot see left, and I cannot see backwards. So 3 of the cardinal directions of this active radar dish are being completely blocked off. That's out of the 5 that it's capable of detecting. So really, I am only getting 2 directions of detection out of this 360 radar, forwards and up. Those are the only 2 basically angles that I'm going to be able to detect with that Radar 360. And for that, I might as well place down 2 Radar 90s instead. I'll require a little bit more processing power, but I will get better quality detection more accurately in both of those directions. So I could stick down a radar 90 there and a radar 90 there and end up with better detection out of the deal, rather than just putting one on top. So that's very important to note. You want to make sure, especially if you're using these 360 trackers, that you are getting maximum value out of them by placing them somewhere where their view is completely unobstructed in every cardinal direction. Cardinal directions being, the forwards, backwards, up, down, left, and right. So that's how the detectors work as far as being obstructed. Trackers are a little bit more fine-tuned. So a tracker here, say this radar gimbal, will be able to angle its radar dish and see out in ways that are not cardinal directions. So if I come out to here, this radar dish can see out this angle that I'm looking right here. So it can see almost directly sideways, and that's really useful. It will actually be able to see a very large arc if you look all around this vehicle. Now, obviously, this is not the best position for this because it could be blown off by anything that shoots the front of the vehicle, but overall, the point I'm trying to make is this is not obstructed by very many things because it's not obstructed by this one jet engine on the side over here. It can still look out that angle and get a fairly good read on everything around it. Same is the case for this laser rangefinder here. This is excellent at detecting things in a lot of different angles. Alright, so coming back here and looking at this retroreflection detector, I've placed this out the bottom of the vehicle, and you'll note that this is not obstructed in any way. That's because these can be obstructed. If I look at this one, now that I've placed another one outside of it, line of sight left is blocked, so it can't detect in that direction. This one can't see right. So this one, the retroreflection, and in fact all passive sensors, except for the wireless snooper, all three of these require line of sight in cardinal directions. Important to note. The camera gimbal tracker over here, though, is a tracker, and it's gimbaled, so that can see out any direction that it has access to. So it'll be able to see almost everything out the bottom of the vehicle, despite not actually being placed in a very good position. Normally it would not be able to see forwards if this was say a radar 90 detector, or a radar 360. It would not be able to see forwards, it would not be able to see up. So there's some reasons behind altering your placement of detection based on whether you're placing a tracker or a detector. So that is based on, or that's all the placement notes that I have, except for one. Some of these detectors and trackers can see through glass blocks. Now, glass is not a particularly effective armor block. As you can see here, this has a health of 60 and an armor of 1 for a glass block. Compare that to a metal block where we have a health of 350. That's like 8 times as much, and not quite 8 times, rather, and an armor of 15. So that is way, way more durable. So you can't really rely on glass necessarily to armor your detection, but if you just want to make something that looks really sleek and performs well with low drag, say if you're making a very fast jet and you don't want detection components with all their awkward little angles and stuff sticking out the sides and slowing you down, you can hide those behind glass blocks and get away with it, depending on the type of detection. Not all of these can be hidden behind glass, but many of them can. The ones that can are all noted in the descriptions as the last sentence, usually, in the description. So like cameras can see through glass, IR cameras does not say it can be detected through glass. Radar cannot detect through glass, and let's see, retroreflection can see through glass. Yeah, you get the idea. So some of these detection methods can be obscured by smoke. I didn't mention this before. The laser rangefinder tracker, smoke can obscure this, so if there's a smoke cloud between you and the target, this will not provide you detection. And yeah, you want to be careful with all of these types of detection that can be obscured by various things. Just make sure that you aren't going to be completely thrown for a loop by a vehicle using one type of countermeasure. Alright, so that is pretty much all of the physical aspects of detection. Next up is the settings. If you hit Q on any of these trackers, then we get into some interesting stuff. I'm going to go ahead and spawn in, let's just throw a Marauder in here and turn off its ability to fire. And this vehicle will try and fly back here and get to an appropriate range and then point at the target, as I have a point at AI behavior in here. So this is getting reasonably good detection, but you can kind of see it's all over the place here. These are various different selectors that will show you graphs of more or less what our detection of this vehicle looks like. So we can see the position error over time, we can see our estimate of where the vehicle is going to be and how off that is. Yeah, so all of these are various different looks into how our detection system is performing. Starting off with the bearing error, we can see right off the bat our bearing is kind of all over the place. We're getting detections every which way. And the cyan lines here are the angular error. The crosses are angular error in degrees between the measured direction and the actual direction. So the higher these crosses are, the more difference there is between where we are detecting the vehicle and where the vehicle actually is. You can see those are kind of scattered all over the place. So you want to get all of this as low as possible. And the trick here is the auto adjust buttons. The auto adjust buttons do a reasonable job of getting you to a closer spot than you were before. So it's not perfect, and really what you want to do is carefully set each of your trackers. That being said, and in fact here, if you mouse over the vehicle, you can actually, or mouse over one of these trackers, you can see a red circle being drawn around it on the vehicle. That's kind of neat. I've not noticed that before. Anyway, so what we're seeing here is this is detecting a target. This radar gimbal tracker is seeing that target. That's great. And we're still getting some pretty inaccurate detection over here. Well, our radar gimbal is only being used a little bit for bearing and a little bit for range. So what is the radar gimbal good at? Well, it's alright at range and it's alright at angle. So that's fairly reasonable. We also have a camera gimbal on here that's excellent at angular error and kind of poor at range. Okay, so if we go out of build mode and go back into the Q menu, let's make sure that our camera, yes, that is being used very strongly for bearing and very little for range. But why don't we just go ahead and turn range completely off on that? We're not really getting good range from it. We don't really want to use the range estimate from that. Similarly, the radar gimbal tracker, well, we can use that at a fairly low priority. Laser rangefinder tracker. This is definitely our best way of getting range on this vehicle. Let's go ahead and jack that all the way up. But a laser rangefinder tracker, if we go look at our component here, that is over here. Angular error to the in the bearing to the target is 1 degree. It's not particularly great. Let's go ahead and with the laser rangefinder tracker drop the bearing accuracy weight. So you can fine-tune this a little bit, and that is going to give you better detection than if you just let the auto adjust deal with everything. Some of these will have a chance to detect the target that is based on the target's properties. So in this case, that Marauder over there is pretty obviously using some sort of active camera or visual detection. So I'm getting a reasonably good chance on any given tick of game time or each tick that this sensor operates, in this case 5 times a second. Every tick of that, that is on every 1/5 of a second, I have an 82% chance to detect the current target. And it's going to get the angular error and the range. In fact, you can see it in this mouse over here. It's going to get the range fairly accurately and the bearing pretty inaccurately. And I could reduce that, but the range here from the retroreflection sensor is actually quite good. So it's, in this case, getting very good detection on that. So yeah, overall, this is trying to get an ideal bearing and range, and trying to predict the enemy's position very accurately based on our detections from all of these detectors and all of these sensors. Really, the auto adjust will do fine in 90% of cases. That is just a general rule of thumb. You can tune these and you will get better performance out of them if you tune the sensors based on the ideal performance here. So like in this case, we have a radar 360. For this particular vehicle that we're aiming at, it doesn't have a very good chance to detect the current target. It's a Marauder. It's using wood. Wood does not have a very large radar signature. Likewise, its bearing, it's just not got a whole lot of stuff above the waterline. So it's not a very big target, it's not very high up, and it's not very reflective to radar signals. So really, there's just not a whole lot of chance for this radar to detect the target. The trackers up here have a much better chance to detect the target. You can see those moving up and down. So more or less what your goal is with all of this is just to fine-tune these sensors so that you detect the types of target that you want to see well. And the types of target that you want to see well are going to be based on what your defenses are, what your vehicle type is, and what weapons you're armed with. For the most part, those three things are going to dictate what types of things you want to see and engage well. So with a little bit of forethought, you can do a very good job of tuning all of these up, and you're probably going to do a better job than the auto adjust. But really, if you just want to slap detection all over your vehicle and hit auto adjust and let the game handle it for you, it's going to do an okay job. So yeah, moving right along. The last thing to look at is actually some defensive mechanisms against detection here. So I've gone out into build mode on this vehicle, and I've just zoomed out all the way, and I believe if you hit the middle mouse button here, you can see this. Over here, scroll down on this list a bit, we have the semicolon hotkey. And this isn't immediately obvious, but what this will do is cycle through detection ranges. And you can see how easily your vehicle is detected by various different types of sensors at various different ranges. So if I hit semicolon here, we can look around here. And let's see, what are we viewing? We are viewing heat. So in this case, we have really a fairly large, detection radius for heat. If I move my cursor out here in build mode a lot. So there's a lot of things going on here. Out in the left and right, we can see a couple of numeric values, and up at the top we can see one, and there's a few on various different points of arc. And then we can see one out here. Those numbers indicate the easel, or the 1.0, I would assume, detection radius in that direction. So like out front here, I've got 260 meters. So that is because I'm firing off jets in the front, and those are generating a lot of heat. Those are making it very easy for an infrared camera to see me from the front. Okay, so if I want to avoid that, what do? Well, I use something like dead blades instead of jets. I would use a dedicated helicopter blade, and I would propel myself forwards and backwards that way, and that would greatly reduce my heat signature. Other ways of reducing my heat, I could use, say, a steam engine or something instead of an RTG on that vehicle. I could replace all the jets with dead blades. Things like that would help reduce my heat signature. Also here, if I... actually, let's just go ahead and cycle through to the next detection. This is visible range. So, yeah, visible range on this vehicle is massive. Part of that is the time of day. One thing I haven't talked about with the visual detectors, you can see with cameras based on the time of day. If you're trying to run a stealthy vehicle, don't enter combat in the middle of the day if possible, because it's going to make cameras have a much easier time of detecting you. Not good. So, yeah, just avoid your visual detection range or try and lower your visual detection range if you're trying to avoid cameras. Again, you can help with that with smoke. You can help with that with flying at night instead of during the day. You can also help with that by being underwater. Cameras don't work so very well underwater. So next up on the list is the radar detection range. On this vehicle, that's very similar to the camera detection range. And one thing I haven't really talked about all that much is the materials your vehicle is made out of can influence this. So if I was to start replacing all of the metal here with light alloy, I'm going to start reducing that detection range. So right now, let's say in the up direction I've got 7730 meters. Let's just go ahead and plop down a bunch of light alloy here instead of this metal. And we are now down to 7539. Not a huge difference, partially because we have a lot of exposed components here that are the main reflectors. If I was to strip all of the external components off this vehicle and just leave armor exposed, especially if that armor was light alloy, my radar detection range would go down quite considerably. As it is, you can see here, anything with a radar dish is going to be able to see me, and that quite easily. The only way to obscure that is to coat my entire vehicle in light alloy and things that are very radar reflective. So I'm kind of out of luck there. Alright, so next up in the list is sonar. So we have sonar here. Yeah, we're not detectable by sonar. We're not in the water. Sonar only operates underwater. We're fine. We don't have to worry about sonar at all. And the last thing is the wireless snoop range. That is based off the number and range that the wireless transmitters on this vehicle have to transmit, and also based on this inter-vehicle transmitter. If I was to strip this off and strip off some of these, let's say this longest wireless receiver, that starts reducing my wireless snooper detection range. However, then I can't use wireless, and I need to string AI connectors just all over everything. Not terribly practical, for a lot of vehicles anyway. Okay, so that is most of the detection types, and if we hit semicolon again, it just turns that off. That's really all there is to it. I think that's a pretty thorough discussion of our detection. Next tutorial, we're going to start getting into missile vehicles, or rather missile weapons, and those are actually going to build off of detection types, because missiles tend to be guided by detection. So all of these same concepts are going to get brought out again and applied in that tutorial. Thanks for watching, hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next time. Thanks.